Hello and welcome back to this mess, or if you're new, it's a mess.
Disclaimer time. Disclaimer. Don't sue me. Thank you.
Today's video is going to be long. I can already tell because the script I have written for it is 31 pages long. Let's just get right into it. For today's drama catch-up, I'm going to be covering the incredibly eventful timeline of the Frenemies Podcast featuring Trisha Paytas and Ethan Klein. Trisha is a adult content creator. She's a longtime YouTuber. She's been in a ton of reality shows, and she was most recently the co-host of the Frenemies Podcast with Ethan Klein, who is also a longtime content creator here on YouTube. He's known for his H3H3 podcast with his wife Ela, who is the designer and founder of the brand Teddy Fresh. Kind of wearing a knockoff Teddy Fresh sweater. Sorry, I got it at Target. My bad. Okay, Target's 20, Teddy Fresh is 80. We know math here. In September of 2020, Trisha and Ethan started the Frenemies Podcast. They had a pink and black set to kind of represent the different polarities of Trisha and Ethan. From there, they created this super popular podcast that abruptly ended due to a lot of drama. And what we're going to talk about today is the drama, the timeline, the everything, why it ended, my opinions on it. I'm also going to be doing my makeup while we talk about this because I want to. To understand how all this happened, we have to backtrack a little bit to when Ethan and Trisha first met. Back in late 2019, Ethan had Trisha on the H3H3 podcast, and they were talking about Trisha's recent scandal. At the time, she had made the transgender video where she came out as a transgender man, and I put air quotes around it because a lot of people are kind of skeptical of that video in whether or not Trisha was trolling or being genuine with their coming out. Oh, by the way, Trisha goes by they, them, but I've seen that they are also okay with she, her, or she, they, but I know the preference is they. So I'm going to do my best to respect that and use their proper pronouns. Please just be patient with my brain. It doesn't work as fast as I would like it to. So Trisha was on Ethan's podcast to discuss the transgender video, as well as to kind of call out Ethan or confront Ethan about a video he made about them or that included them some time back. Ethan is kind of I wouldn't say critic and I wouldn't say troll. He's just honestly, he's just some guy on the internet. He's funny and he does like a variety of things. But in this particular video where he talked about Trisha without first meeting her, in the video Ethan used Trisha in, he was talking about bad Photoshop before and afters on Instagram, how a lot of women tend to use Facetune or Photoshop to adjust their looks to meet a certain standard or to feel better about themselves, whatever the cause may be. But Ethan was using a lot of before and afters, and one of them was Trisha. And Trisha, although does admit to using Photoshop, they are also quite open about the fact that they use Photoshop. And a lot of the before and afters that Ethan featured were not genuine before and afters. Like Trisha had posted it themselves. They were like, hey, look, I could be super feminine and like sexy, and I can also be like this, person who isn't perfect. I don't know. I don't know, like, I wouldn't say ugly because Trisha's not ugly. So that was one of the things that Trisha really wanted to talk about on the podcast with Ethan. And during this podcast, it's actually revealed by Ethan that Trisha did indeed make money off of the transgender video that they had published. Previously, they had protested that they do indeed demonetize all of the scandalous and outrageous videos that get them in a lot of trouble. But Ethan kind of maneuvered his way into Trisha's YouTube studio and saw that they did indeed make money off of the video and said how much. It was a bit of a weird moment. And don't get me wrong, Trisha should definitely be criticized for a lot of things, including the transgender video. But it is a bit weird to kind of force your way into somebody's YouTube studio. I don't know. It's a bit of a weird moment. Anyway, it happens, and Trisha is kind of upset with Ethan, but the episode continues, and they end up ordering pizza and having a little bit of a pizza party. Trisha doesn't seem to hate Ethan as much. Obviously, they joke with each other, and they have a good back and forth. It made a really great episode, and it definitely showed that Ethan and Trisha could have some kind of professional relationship moving forward. Maybe he would have her on the podcast again, who knows? I want to note that I'm not brushing over the scandal that Trisha was in regarding the transgender video. It's just not really a part of the main plot of the overall Frenemies saga, so I don't want to emphasize unnecessarily because we got a lot to go through, but please understand that that situation was definitely a situation and deserves to be analyzed still because a lot of things Trisha did were shady and wrong in my opinion. Following that podcast, Trisha was actually back on the H3H3 channel for the second season of The Bachelorette. The first season of The Bachelor was ruined because Ian found somebody on Instagram and ended up just having a relationship. But Ethan just wanted Trisha to be transparent in case they started a relationship with anyone, they can adjust the show accordingly. Trisha wasn't because they were definitely seeing Moses behind the scenes and not telling Hila and not telling Ethan. Ethan and Hila actually talk about it as the second episode of The Bachelor and kind of give a little update like, hey, not gonna happen. They're obviously seeing each other. My nose contour is fucked. On the same episode of The Bachelor update, Ethan and Hila kind of make some rather, I'm gonna say mean comments about Trisha and Moses. Now, I can understand why they might feel some type of way about Trisha dating Moses and getting involved with the family, but at the same time Moses is a grown man, and if he's interested in Trisha and they get along and they make each other happy, then there should be no reason for all this and all that. Trisha is an interesting and complex person, and I'm sure given the right opportunity and the right headspace, they're able to form incredible connections with people, as we'll see with Ethan moving forward. But at this point, Trisha and Moses are just seeing each other, and whether or not it's serious, Ethan and Hila don't know, but all they know is that they're seeing each other consistently because they have similar stories, or, you know, there's different things that Ethan and Hila are noticing in the background. Like in one of them, Trisha posted a story of having dinner with someone, and Moses had some signature stickers sitting on the coffee table that Hila had recognized. Now, the main problem that Ethan and Hila had when Trisha and Moses started dating was that Moses and Hila have a bit of a situation with their family. It's a little tense, it's a little hard to navigate, and with somebody like Trisha who can be a little too open and a little too, I don't want to say unstable, they can be a little much for some people. It could definitely rock the boat if the environment is not able to support that kind of personality. Ethan just has his own problems with Trisha and a lot of things. I'm sure he didn't really change his opinion on Trisha after the podcast, or it definitely didn't seem like it. And there's several comments made throughout this series and throughout all of the videos I've watched that Moses kind of likes to stir the pot with his family because they are so conservative. After this podcast in September of 2020, Ethan and Trisha begin their podcast series together called Frenemies. The first episode is basically them talking about how Trisha and Moses are still together over the course of the pandemic, even though they did break up a couple times. They also talk about how Trisha has access to Moses's messages and frequently goes through them. And this is where the comment about Moses dating Trisha in order to spite his family comes up. And Trisha says that she's fine with it because she started dating Moses in order to get at Ethan. It was kind of a bonus that Ethan was bothered by it, but they obviously were interested in Moses. But they make comments along the lines of, yeah, well, I kind of just want to date him so I could bother you a little bit. Obviously, it's nice that their relationship worked out and they enjoy each other's company a lot, but they both kind of started off on a weird foot, let's say. And then they talk about something that's a little weird and kind of foreshadows a lot of upcoming events for the Frenemies crew. They talk about a text that Trisha sent Ethan about Moses when they had a little bit of a break. And it was accusing Moses of talking to fans in a weird way. Trisha texted this to Ethan right after they had a big fight with Moses, and they later admit that this was because of the fight and they were feeling rather spiteful and angry at Moses, and what they said isn't entirely true or over-exaggerated because they, again, were feeling emotional after the fight. Ethan kind of drops it and says, okay, well, maybe just don't go through Moses's messages and trigger yourself unnecessarily. He obviously doesn't say it like that. And then the podcast ends with Trisha saying that they should send some love to Keemstar, who we're going to talk about much later. But Ethan's like, okay, well, maybe no, let's not do that. And it's just a weird way to end the first episode. Now, I'm not going to focus on each episode individually of the podcast. That would just be way too much. I think it's much more interesting if we focus on the episodes where Trisha and Ethan have a fight, and then the recovery episodes where they have Dr. Drew kind of play marriage counselor. So to start off, the first episode where Trisha and Ethan have a bit of a fight is during the Halloween series where they dress up as different characters throughout the month of October. In this particular episode, Ethan is Uncle Fester and Trisha is Jennifer's Body, aka the best movie of all time. No, it's not, but it's pretty good. You can kind of tell throughout this episode that Trisha and Ethan are kind of annoying each other. They make a lot of backhanded comments, and although that's kind of their whole shtick as the Frenemies podcast, they're frenemies, it just seems a little more personal this time. You can kind of feel the jabs. So the moment that the fight gets escalated is when Ethan calls Trisha crazy. And although they've made comments like that to each other before, in the context of this particular conversation, it was kind of going a little too far for Trisha. They got really upset and defensive back and started snapping at Ethan, saying things like, you are hypocritical, you always think you're right, and all this other stuff, really digging at him. And while Trisha's going off, Ethan's trying really hard to say, hey, my intentions were not malicious, I'm not trying to make you upset or offend you. And Trisha's saying, well, what are you talking about? You're always offensive and you never apologize and you always think you're this and that. And it's just kind of clear that neither one of them have set boundaries with each other and they don't understand when to pull punches. They start to fight about money and how Trisha constantly promotes her OnlyFans on the podcast and how Ethan doesn't get a cut of that. And then Trisha brings up the financial situation with Frenemies and how Ethan takes a cut for production. They don't get too into it this time, but this is obviously a problem behind the scenes that does not get resolved. Ethan kind of starts talking about how Trisha has questionable content on their OnlyFans. They did a collab with their sister and they didn't have sex with each other or do anything sexual to each other. From my understanding, I didn't see it. Don't quote me. But Ethan kind of says that it has some incestuous undertones that Trisha is playing into, or Ethan accuses Trisha of playing into, and Trisha says, not at all, you're shaming all sex workers, and starts to twist his words a little bit. It's just, it's a whole mess. And where everything just goes for the worst is when Ethan and Trisha are talking about Ethan and Gila's anniversary plans and how they're going to go to a hotel and just hang out. And Trisha asks, can them and Moses babysit Theodore, who is Ethan and Gila's baby? And Ethan's like, no, absolutely not. The fuck? Trisha gets kind of offended, like, you wouldn't let Theodore and Uncle watch them overnight, and Ethan's like, definitely not. Ethan says he would trust Moses to watch Theodore for a couple hours during the day, but definitely not both of them overnight. After Theodore is brought up, Trisha kind of starts talking about how they want to have babies and how they and Moses want to have a child together, how they're trying to have a child together. One of the things that is kind of interesting throughout the course of the Frenemies podcast is that Trisha and Hila are both trying to conceive a baby. They're both having complications for different reasons, but they are both on the struggle bus when it comes to making a baby. And it's kind of something that they sort of bond over, I would say. And it's a sore spot for Trisha when it comes to having a family and making babies, because they have some particular medical issues that prevent them from having a baby. And although it's not completely impossible, it's definitely very difficult. Once they're talking about babies, they kind of get onto the subject of authenticity and how Trisha is very open and very honest about a lot of aspects around their life. And Ethan says they are the same way. Ethan is quite transparent with his audience and talks about a lot of personal things. And Trisha says, well, you don't talk about the whole pill addiction that you had. And Ethan is kind of taken aback for a moment and is like, what? Kind of shocked that Trisha would bring that up during the conversation, but they did, and Ethan's like, I didn't really want to talk about that, but why does it matter? Why do people need to know about this? And Trisha's like, well, you're saying you're authentic, but people don't know about this and you don't talk about this. Clearly it makes you uncomfortable. And it's kind of clear that Trisha was trying to poke at Ethan and wanted to say something that, I don't want to say put Ethan in a corner, but definitely caught him off guard. This leads to a bigger fight when Ethan says to Trisha, this is why it's dangerous to be your friend. You'll weaponize stuff people will tell you in private. And Trisha's like, what are you talking about? You talk about my private business all the time. You exposed the whole transgender video when we first met, and you exposed the text messages I sent you about Moses during the first episode. And they go back and forth, and they both are right and they both are wrong in the situation. But regardless, the conversation gets very heated and Trisha ends up walking off the set. After this episode, they have a little bit of a buffer episode where Trisha and Ethan obviously had a conversation off camera about the events and reconciled a little bit, but they're obviously a little on edge still. After the buffer episode, Trisha and Ethan return to Frenemies to have a conversation with Dr. Drew, who is a television doctor. I don't know his credentials, but he's like Dr. Phil or Dr. whatever, one of those. And during this episode, they are still doing the cosplay for October thing, and Ethan is dressed up as Trisha, and Trisha is dressed up as Ethan. Trisha kind of starts off the episode saying that they're in a bad mood because Ethan used Trisha's makeup people, even though Trisha had recommended other people. That way they don't have to sacrifice their own personal makeup time. But regardless, they were fine and happy to lend their super talented people to Ethan. And Ethan looks super great as Trisha with these big fake boobs and this big ridiculous wig, whereas Trisha's mustache was already peeling off within the first 5 minutes of the episode. So they weren't feeling very good about their appearance and were off to a bad start. They talk about mental health a lot during this episode, particularly Trisha's, and right off the bat, I have to say, Dr. Drew is so clearly favoring Trisha, not only in this episode, but in the next one, which of course they fight again. Did you think it was smooth sailing after this? Ma'am. During the episode, Trisha talks about how it's really hard for them to control when they are experiencing a lot of intense emotions and triggers. Ethan also acknowledges that he definitely took things a bit too far and misspoke on certain things, and Trisha doesn't really apologize, or at this point in the podcast, they don't really reflect too much on their own contributions to the disagreement, I want to say, the debacle, the bullshit. They also talk about that same video that Ethan initially made that featured Trisha and the other girls that were before and after photoshopped. Trisha makes it a point to say that Ethan needs to apologize to the other people mentioned in the video along with Trisha. They found Ethan's comments to be rather misogynistic, and that if Ethan doesn't apologize to the other people in the video, then he's not really sorry. He's just saying it to Trisha because Trisha's there. And Dr. Drew kind of shuts that down and is like, do the other people feel offended? No? Then don't be fighting fights that you don't need to. Okay, Trisha? They also talk about Trisha's gender identity and how that may play into their uncontrollable outbursts and intense emotions. They also clear up the whole pill addict comment. Ethan explains that he was never a pill addict per se. He was definitely abusing and using prescription painkillers recreationally on the weekends. Trisha acknowledges that they did indeed over dramatize the condition because they wanted to be a bitch in that moment. The main takeaway from this whole session is that Trisha has a hard time recognizing and understanding boundaries when they're not clearly defined for them. And Ethan, unconsciously or consciously, pushes the boundaries with Trisha, pushes their buttons, and it starts to build up this intense reaction in Trisha. And the reason Trisha felt a justification, let's say, in using the pill conversation or the pill anecdote from Ethan in the conversation or in the argument was because they felt Ethan had done the same thing with previous conversations that they had on the podcast. Like when I said the conversation about Moses and a fan and the transgender video earnings, Trisha says that Ethan doesn't respect their boundaries and where they draw the line, so they don't have to respect Ethan's, or that's the tone that Ethan had set by pushing the boundaries with Trisha. By the end of the episode, Ethan acknowledges where he had done wrong to Trisha and offers a sincere apology. And Trisha says that they don't accept the apology. They are not sorry for what they said. And yeah, that's it. And something that became clear to me by the end of the video after watching it several times is that Ethan's mental health was not considered at all by Dr. Drew or Trisha. Like, Ethan, and this is no tea, he talks about it a lot. Ethan is taking antidepressants. He has openly talked about his struggles with self-worth, with depression, all this kinds of stuff. So it's really frustrating to watch this video and see all the care and consideration in the world be put on Trisha's needs and Trisha's mental health, but everyone seems to disregard, especially Dr. Drew and Trisha, seem to disregard Ethan's mental health and the effects that Trisha has on him. And Dr. Drew 100% bullies Ethan this entire episode into obeying and being submissive to Trisha's mental health needs. And I understand that Trisha needs a little bit of extra care considering a lot of the very abusive and traumatic things they've been through. But at the same time, that doesn't mean Ethan has to suffer in silence. And it's very frustrating to watch this video and see Dr. Drew take such care and consideration for Trisha's mental health, but not at all for Ethan's. Following the first Dr. Drew episode, they had about 5 episodes that went pretty much unscathed. They didn't have any crazy fights. Everything for the most part was okay. But then episode 13 hit and it got ugly. The show starts off with Trisha and Ethan kind of off to a bad start because Trisha acknowledges they aren't in a great mood. They had a fight with Moses on the way over and they just are not really feeling it that day. The whole theme of this episode is that Ethan and Trisha are going to test out some celebrity beauty hacks like turmeric toothbrush and other weird things that somehow work for very attractive people. But during the episode, they decide, okay, well, you know what? We're not in a good mood. Let's order some pizza. Because Ethan and Trisha love having pizza together. Keep in mind, the last time they ordered pizza was the same episode that they had their other fight on. So it's kind of like ooh, are we heading down a bad path? While they're ordering pizza on the phone, I have to say Ethan is just really annoying. Trisha's on the phone trying to order this goddamn special pizza box that comes with 2 pizzas and a bunch of other shit. And Ethan is over there screaming, "What kind of crust do you have? This and that." Like, who cares? Shut up. Stop. I hate when people scream at you while you're on the phone ordering something. That's just so juvenile. But Ethan's kind of just being really annoying this whole episode, and I can kind of see Trisha getting a little more agitated as the episode continues. They also talk about money again because clearly they cannot seem to have a conversation about it off screen that would just settle everything. But they talk about money again, and as the episode continues and things start to dial down between testing the beauty products, Trisha makes an off-the-cuff comment about Hila, saying that they should have them on the podcast. Actually, Ethan is the one who brings up Hila first. They were talking about how Trisha had turmeric on their teeth or on their mouth after doing the whole beauty challenge, and Trisha was saying that Ethan didn't tell them about the previous episode where they had powdered sugar from the donut on their mouth. And Ethan said, "Oh, Hila pointed that out too. I should have been more observant, my bad." And that's when Trisha kind of got, I guess, the idea to ask, "Hey, can we have Hila on the show, on the Frenemies show?" Ethan immediately snaps and says no. And Trisha's like, "Okay, well, why?" And Ethan kind of backtracks for a second and is like, "Oh, yeah, no, we can have Hila on the show." And Trisha's like, "Well, why did you say no initially?" And Ethan says, "Well, Hila doesn't want to be talked about." Actually, you know what? Scratch this. We're going to cut all of this out. Hila doesn't want to be talked about. And this really rubs Trisha the wrong way because they feel that Ethan and Hila have talked so much about Trisha, so much about Trisha's relationship with Moses on their own podcast, and for Ethan to display that Hila didn't want to be mentioned at all whatsoever, not even an inkling, it kind of made Trisha like, well, what the fuck? Then you can't talk about me. What the hell? You're a hypocrite. All this very intense stuff. And Ethan straight up misrepresents what Hila meant when she said, "Don't talk about me" or "Don't discuss me" on the podcast. Hila meant that she doesn't want Trisha and Ethan to talk about the family stuff because it's causing a lot of trouble behind the scenes for Hila and Moses. A lot of the things Ethan and Trisha talk about on the podcast get back to Moses and Hila's family, and they have a lot of issues with it. But instead of saying that, Ethan kind of just brushes off Trisha and is like, "We're just not talking about it, let's move on." And Trisha's, again, insulted by it because they feel that Hila is acting like she's too good for the podcast. The conversation continues anyway, despite Ethan's best efforts to go back to the beauty products. Ethan tells Trisha that she needs to talk to Moses about it because Hila talks to Moses and says, "Hey, Trisha needs to stop doing this and that." And Trisha makes an excellent point and says, "Well, why doesn't Hila just talk to me directly? If I'm doing something that's bothering her, why is she going through Moses to tell me? Why doesn't she just tell me? She has my number." I understand if Hila is not a super confrontational person or if she doesn't feel super comfortable with Trisha in order to say those kinds of things and would rather go the diluted route through Moses. I get that. But at the same time, if you want someone to stop doing something, you need to just tell them. You can't just use the game of telephone to get your point across. It never will. Even though it is a good point Trisha brings up, she doesn't really package it in the right way and it comes off very aggressive. Like, "Well, why doesn't Hila just freaking talk to me?" It's like, well, what do you think? And in the heat of the argument, when they have a moment of pause, Trisha makes an offhand comment about Hila's parenting style. Trisha says, "If I'm lucky enough to have a baby, I would definitely not hire a nanny, that's for sure." Obviously throwing shade at Hila for having a nanny and shade at Ethan for not having a family member take care of their baby while they're both at work. And Ethan's like, "What do you mean?" It's coming from the perspective of somebody who does not have a child, who doesn't work full-time with a baby, and it seems very ignorant of Trisha to say that they definitely wouldn't hire a nanny because they would drop everything to be with that child because family is important. And while that's totally respectable, I know a lot of people who have quit their jobs or rewired their priorities to be more about their children rather than careers. Totally fine. But it's also totally fine for Hila to still have a career and have some help taking care of their baby. There's truly no wrong way to raise a baby as long as that baby is loved, happy, and healthy. And of course, in that moment, Ethan has a need to defend his wife and defend himself as a father and as somebody who I'm sure has spent a lot of sleepless nights with their baby. And he starts asking Trisha, "All right, well, what do you think? You think this? You think that? You're going to drop everything?" And Trisha meets him with the same energy and doesn't back down from their point. There's nothing that will convince Trisha otherwise. A damn Taurus if I've ever seen one. And I just have to make a quick comment about Trisha's whole, if I had a baby, I would do XYZ argument. Hypotheticals don't work in debate. Hypotheticals don't work in arguments because they are what they are. They're hypothetical situations. They aren't based in fact or reality. And the reality of the situation is Hila is a working mom with 2 major companies, Teddy Fresh and H3H3, that she has participation in and manages. So it's understandable if she doesn't want to drop everything to take care of her son 24/7 and would rather hire help to do so during the day so she can work on whatever she needs to. And the same with Ethan, who has his own company to run. There's nothing wrong with either one of them having help to take care of their baby. And Trisha's hypothetical situation of her own child doesn't warrant anything in this conversation. The conversation doesn't get any better. It continues to go downhill, and they start to talk about family drama and get personal things involved. And it gets to a point where Trisha is so angry with Ethan, so ready to leave, that they say that Ethan is a cuck, they call Hila a cunt, and they storm off the set crying and screaming at Moses, saying that they don't care if this ruins their relationship, they're never coming back to the house, they're never going to talk to Ethan again, they are done with the Frenemies podcast. Bear in mind, this whole argument was 20 minutes long. 20 minutes. I don't know why they didn't pause and say, you know what, let's have a quick conversation before this gets out of hand, because this is too much. 20 minutes? 20 minutes. No. Maybe it's just my Sagittarius ass, but I could not be angry at somebody for 20 minutes. Oh my God. So after the argument and Trisha storms off set, Ethan kind of makes a few last remarks to Moses on his way out because Moses delivered the pizza. And Ethan says a few final things to the audience before thanking them for watching, and they cut the show. Following that episode, there was no buffer, and Ethan and Trisha dive right into episode 14, where they have a conversation with Dr. Drew again and Dr. Young, who helped administer a couple of personality tests for them. This episode is centered around 2 things. One, understanding how Trisha got to the point that they did during the fight in the previous episode. And the second is to analyze the data from 2 personality tests that Ethan and Trisha took. One is a narcissism scale and the other is the dark triad. Sounds very conniving. Oh my goodness, dark triad? What are you, the Justice League? Before they get into the test results, they talk about the fight from the previous episode, and right off the bat, Dr. Drew is again just taking Trisha's side a little too much and really coming down on Ethan. He even calls Ethan a cuck a couple times in the episode to kind of poke fun, which I understand everyone's in good humor, but like, if you're the doctor in this situation, maybe act like one. Ethan starts off with an apology to Trisha, saying that he didn't mean to push their buttons and all this stuff. Dr. Drew interrupts him and is like, I don't feel like you meant that. And Ethan's like, what the fuck are you talking about? Of course I did. And it's just, it's already weird. But then they get into the relationship between Moses and Hila, and although they're not there to speak for themselves, they explain that the core reason that this fight happened in the first place, or that the other fight happened, was because of things that are happening behind the scenes that aren't necessarily between Trisha and Ethan, but rather Moses and Hila and their family. They then talk about the comment that Trisha made about Hila, calling her a C-word and calling Ethan a cuck. Dr. Drew starts to explain Trisha's behaving and describe it as splitting, and Trisha describes having these sort of blackout situations where they're unable to control themselves and unable to control how they react to certain things, kind of similar to what they talked about in the previous episode, but a little bit more intensely since they now have more data, I guess, to analyze. They also talk about the parenting comment, and Trisha again claims that they were just expressing their opinion after Ethan asked them about it, but in reality, if you watch the clip back, Trisha just says the comment out of nowhere just to be a bitch. But Ethan does admit that he was 100% pushing Trisha's buttons and that he wasn't helping the situation whatsoever, and Trisha admits that they most definitely overstepped the bounds and overreacted in a lot of ways, and apologized to Hila privately already about the comments they made, and agree that there was a lack of communication and understanding between them. After that, they get into the test results and they have the doctors kind of analyze it. I don't know if it's super necessary to the plot of Frenemies, but just to give you a brief summary. On the narcissism quiz, it was the NPI with a narcissistic personality inventory. Out of 40, Trisha scored a 30 and Ethan scored an 8. That kind of shows that Trisha is a little bit more narcissistic than Ethan, and Ethan is a little probably too unnarcissistic, maybe even self-conscious. On the dark triad, Ethan scored lower than Trisha, but Trisha didn't score super obnoxious either. They kind of just analyze these results as a way of kind of explaining perhaps how their dynamics work so well together and how they can often have butting head moments like those big fights. And the episode isn't as eventful as the previous Dr. Drew episode because they really don't talk about the fight too much, just for like the first 30, maybe 40 minutes, and then they get into the test results. And Ethan and Trisha obviously had some kind of conversation behind the scenes that really resolved the situation, and they were just hashing out the details and the final notes on that situation in front of their audience with Dr. Drew. After that episode with Dr. Drew, they go on their holiday break, and Ethan and Trisha return in the new year with a cute little parody version of the Streamies called the Steamies. They both seem to be in a really good place, Trisha especially, and they produce a lot of good episodes after the second Dr. Drew episode. Now, I'm gonna note something that doesn't necessarily affect the whole timeline of Frenemies, but it is worth noting because it is public information and it has been put out there, so I feel like I should cover it. Episode 17 centers around the whole situation between Trisha Paytas, Jeffree Star, and Jeffree Star's hairdresser. During the episode, while Trisha is describing what happened between them, Jeffree, and the hairdresser, they also open up about an incident that happened to them in their youth. Trisha describes a time where their teacher was abusing them during games in class, and although they went to the principal about it, they weren't believed, and it didn't result in any kind of justice, and Trisha was kind of left to deal with that trauma. They also claimed that this teacher later on was exposed for watching and having child pornography on their computer, and that he also potentially might have abused another child that the principal actually believed, because Trisha mentioned during her youth she was a pathological liar and would often tell tales that weren't true, so whenever they were telling the truth, people didn't believe them. From this episode, the H3H3 subreddit actually located the teacher in question because Trisha not only named him, but also the school that they went to at the time, and encouraged people to investigate further if they choose to, and of course, people chose to. It's unclear to me whether or not he was actually accused of anything. From my understanding, there were no records found of him actually being arrested or anything like that. But what was found was all of his relatives' contact information, because he is dead, deceased, not with us at the moment, and cannot speak his side on the story that Trisha has said. It's a very difficult subject to navigate because on this channel, for me particularly, I like to believe victims first, and I err on the side of caution that nobody would want to lie about these kinds of things. Nobody would want to make this kind of stuff up because horrible things like what Trisha described happens to people every day, and it's disgusting and unfortunate. However, I do have to recognize the facts that this person that Trisha named is dead and is unable to defend themselves for the accusations that Trisha made about them. As a way to stop people from continuing to send hate to this alleged abuser's family, Ethan decided to publicly announce that the video will be unlisted and that they do apologize for any trouble that this video had caused for the family of this particular person. This is much later after Frenemies had ended where this all happens, but just so you know, there is a missing episode of Frenemies, and that is the reason why it's missing. Back to the Frenemies timeline, like I said, after the second Dr. Drew episode, they did for the most part stay out of trouble. They weren't really fighting on camera as much or as bad, let's say. After that whole hump with Dr. Drew, hump day with Dr. Drew, I'll say after that, Frenemies pretty much skyrocketed because right after that Dr. Drew episode, Ethan and Trisha would end up right in the middle of one of the biggest scandals of 2021 regarding YouTubers.
I was going to include a full breakdown on what happened between David Dobrik, Trisha, and Ethan, and the corresponding events between David, Dirty Dom, Jeff Wittick, and other former Vlog Squad members that centered around a insider article that exposed David and Dirty Dom for participating in some allegedly awful events. However, I realized that it's not entirely significant to the overall Frenemies timeline, and that it would probably add another 40 minutes to this video, which I imagine you don't want because I'm editing it right now at the 40-minute mark and it's just too much. So I highly encourage that you watch either the Frenemies podcast episodes regarding David Dobrik or the H3 episode covering the insider article or the live argument, I would say, between Ethan, Trisha, and Jeff Wittick, who is a former Vlog Squad member. His situation is also important, but again, although it's mentioned and it did add a lot of credibility, let's say, to the Frenemies podcast, both the Jeff Wittick incident and the David Dobrik situation, it's overall not something that truly affects the timeline of the Frenemies podcast. So respectfully, I am not going to include it, but I will potentially do a full David Dobrik dedicated drama catch-up at one point. If you guys want it, let me know in the comments. Thank you.
Fast forwarding to the final episode of Frenemies, titled Talking About Gabby Hanna. Trisha and Ethan are cosplaying once again, and Ethan is dressed up as Uncle Fester, and Trisha is playing Debbie from Addams Family 2. I think it's Addams Family Values. The whole point of this episode is for Trisha to kind of voice her side of the story when it comes to Gabby Hanna. And just to catch you all up on that, Trisha and Gabby have had a long-standing internet beef since 2019 when Hanna published a not-so-inconspicuous Instagram story about Trisha that led to a lot of back and forth online, to a podcast, to blocking each other, to all this other stuff. So during the episode, Trisha just quickly talks about their perspective of Gabby and their whole opinion on what's going on and the whole bullshit that Gabby's doing. Gabby is kind of a trigger for Trisha. They talked about it before, saying that they had to block Gabby after they did the podcast together because Gabby was trying to fill Trisha up with all these lies and misconceptions that made her feel like she was going crazy. So with the environment already being a little bit tense with the subject of Gabby, it wasn't a big shock that this kind of devolved into a bit of another fight. The second half of the episode was supposed to be a segment where Trisha and Ethan answer fan questions, and Trisha makes a lot of under-the-breath comments about how this is unoriginal, no one does these, and the only time YouTubers ever do question videos is if they're running out of ideas, and that they don't understand why there's so much funding going towards Frenemies for them to be coming up with these lazy ideas and all this really rash stuff. And while Trisha's kind of trying to distract Ethan with some other subjects like Brokeback Mountain, it's clear that Ethan really isn't listening to Trisha. And I should mention, they ordered pizza again. They ordered pizza and they fight. I swear, it was a system. It happened every time. So Trisha and Ethan order pizza and they immediately start to fight. Trisha is kind of getting upset and is like, all right, fine, let's just do the stupid questions segment that you want to do. I don't like it. I don't understand it. It's super dumb, all this stuff. And Ethan's like, whoa, why are you getting so angry about this? It's literally just questions from fans. A lot of people were looking forward to this. Why are you all of a sudden getting very testy about it? And Ethan is insisting that Trisha's upset, and Trisha keeps saying, no, I'm not. You saying I'm upset is making me upset. Trisha accuses Ethan of gaslighting them. Ethan accuses Trisha of gaslighting Ethan, and they just start getting at each other. And once again, money is brought up because Trisha is saying that because Ethan takes 5% more than Trisha of the Frenemies cut, he uses that extra 5% to go towards Frenemies. And Trisha feels that that extra 5% should be utilized better and not towards these uncreative ideas like the fan question submissions. And Ethan, despite knowing better, despite knowing that this is just a trap that will get into a bigger situation than it needs to be, starts poking back at Trisha and saying, well, what do you do for the podcast? And Trisha says, well, let me fucking tell you. Trisha claims that they put a lot of effort in regarding ideas and that they want to hire new people and all this stuff, and they want more say in the podcast and the behind the scenes aspects of the podcast. And Ethan says, what are you talking about? You really only contribute a few things, but the crew are the people who put it all together, and your ideas can be just ideas. They mean nothing, and they just start getting into it. And one of the things that Trisha brings up towards the end that I find really interesting is that although she's right in saying that Ethan does repeat a lot of content from the H3H3 podcast to Frenemies, one of the things that Trisha seemed to have a particular gripe with was when Ethan had recycled pregnancy announcement titles from the H3H3 podcast to Frenemies. After an episode of H3H3 After Dark, Hila had announced that she was pregnant and that they were going to have a baby. So the next day when they filmed Frenemies, they used the same announcement title, and Trisha later on kind of felt a little bit uncomfortable with that title because they felt people would get confused about who was pregnant because they already used that title for the After Dark episode where they announced the pregnancy and then they talked about it on Frenemies, but it wasn't really an announcement. And it gets to a point where the podcast is just going down south again. Trisha also then brings up the quality of the crew and how they don't do that good of a job all the time, and that, you know, they do great sometimes, but they don't do great other times. It's a lot of really backhanded comments because the crew had gone out of a lot of their way to make a lot of personalized things for Trisha, including like Twinkies that were Lamborghinis or whatever, and a specialized Steamies award when they had the Steamies ceremony thing at the beginning of the year. Trisha just was very ungrateful for a lot of what the crew did for her in that moment, and it wasn't a good look. They go back and forth on who brought more sponsors, who brought more effort to the podcast, who was more valuable, all this stuff. And it ends with Trisha just unable to continue the podcast and Ethan saying, okay, well, if you're done, then just walk off. And Trisha's like, no, I don't want to walk off. And then you get to have the final words with the audience again. I want this to end. We need to end the episode now. Following that episode, supposedly behind the scenes, Trisha and Ethan had a conversation where they were able to resolve the whole production assistant or production crew situation. They were able to record another episode of Frenemies that will never see the light of day because the events did not stay on good terms for very long. And Trisha had uploaded a video a few days later titled, I'm Stepping Down from Frenemies, where they explained that they will no longer be a part of Frenemies. They feel like Ethan is taking advantage with the 5%. They feel like Frenemies is just not good for their mental health. They feel like they're not welcomed by the crew, all these things. This video has since been deleted, and Ethan also reacts to it, which we're going to talk about now. So Ethan responds to that video with a last Frenemies kind of thing where it's just him, and he walks through all the points that Trisha made about the 5%, about the crew, and he reveals that Trisha had actually texted Ethan saying that they want to fire the whole crew and hire a new one because they felt uncomfortable, that the crew didn't do a good job, and that she provides them with all these great ideas. Once again, just reiterating a lot of the things that they were fighting about during the last episode. And Ethan again explains that the 5% is a production cost. Trisha had agreed to this. They make more than enough money that the 5% really shouldn't matter. And Ethan is a little confusing at this point because he says that he could provide an itemized list to Trisha about what the 5% goes towards, but then later on in the same conversation he says that he couldn't do that because it's just a production fee. That's just the 5%, that's just what it is. And it doesn't necessarily go to this or that, but it's just a fee that they utilize for the resources for the podcast. And Ethan, not thinking clearly, decided to show the crew what Trisha was saying about them. And it's super awkward because not only were they supposed to film a vlog, but that vlog was also centered around the Frenemies merchandise photo shoot that they were going to do later on that week. But because of the weird comments from Trisha about the crew to Ethan, Ethan made the executive decision to cancel that shoot. And in the interim of the shoot and the next Frenemies episode, Trisha uploaded the I'm Quitting Frenemies podcast that took Ethan by surprise because from his understanding, they were good to go. But according to Trisha in this video, they were not good to go. They were very much not good. And one of the specific things that popped up that seemed to bother Trisha in this whole crew situation was that Ethan made a new hire without consulting Trisha, and Trisha felt that because this person's going to be working on the Frenemies podcast, that Trisha should have a say in whether or not they should be hired. But what Trisha doesn't seem to understand is that Frenemies isn't its own entity. It's not its own production. It's a part of the H3H3 umbrella. And in that umbrella, H3 Productions, Ethan is the sole say on who gets hired, who does what, and stuff like that. Trisha didn't have any say in the other people hired. There's no reason for her to have say in this new hire Ethan made anyway, because it's not like they're only working on Frenemies. I hope that makes sense. Trisha, again, just doesn't really understand the boundaries of her role when it comes to Ethan and is continuously pushing it and saying, well, I want this and I want that. And Ethan doesn't properly set up those boundaries and say, hey, you're just the talent or you're just the co-host. You have no say in this or that. Ethan feels like he has met Trisha more than halfway on a lot of things, and she has not met him anywhere near what he feels like he needs. They were also arguing about the characters they were dressed as during that last episode, the Debbie and Uncle Fester cosplay, and initially Trisha agreed to it, saying that, oh my god, it's one of my favorite movies, I love her, to on the podcast saying, oh my god, I have no idea who this is, how can I cosplay them, and getting rather agitated because of it. Ethan's like, well, what the fuck am I supposed to do? She says in a conversation for 1 minute that she loves this and can't wait to do it, and then the next she says, I have no idea who this person is, how am I supposed to do this? It's really hard for somebody to work in those kind of conditions, and I don't blame Ethan for being super frustrated. The whole 5% thing is going to become a constant joke within the H3H3 universe because they talked about it constantly during this episode, during the whole 45 minutes of it, and they reference it continually after. And it's very clear that although Ethan is upset and hurt by Trisha, he does very much love her and vocalizes that he loves her and that he just wants to resolve this so they can all work together as a family and just keep things peaceful. That is not what happens. I can also see Trisha's point of view in that Ethan did not have a solid plan when it came to the financials. I believe they discussed it over text. What really should have happened is when the podcast became an actual idea that they were really going to run with, they should have sat down, had a formal conversation about where the financials were going to go, what cut was where, and Ethan should at first present an itemized list of what it costs to create the production, and from there Trisha can kind of work with a metric of like, okay, well, it costs $50,000 for the set, it costs this and that, allow me to just not think about the rest of it because clearly they've got it handled. It would have alleviated a lot of Trisha's concerns and complaints and given them more of an idea of what Ethan is working with and what the cost of production actually is, rather than just saying it's the cost of production, because that once again kind of feels like Ethan is brushing off Trisha, and Trisha doesn't want to be brushed off. She wants her feelings to be heard, and she wants to have an explanation for what the money is going towards. I can understand that. Following that response Ethan made, Trisha posted numerous TikToks, numerous YouTube videos. I mean, it was like every other day, 1,000 mid-rolls in between all of them, making a good chunk of change off of this whole drama, and it did not die down for even a second. They kept going at each other for a while. The next bump in the road happened when Ethan had to find a way to fill the Frenemies time slot with something else, so he started a podcast with his mom Donna and named it Families. Now, this podcast was fucking genius. It was so good. It was the perfect blend of wholesome and crude and family antics that I think are not present in a lot of other podcasts. Like, this was quite a unique thing for them to do, and it was very successful. I saw comments saying that they almost preferred the Families podcast to the Frenemies podcast, and I have to agree, it was fabulous. We are Donarchs around here, okay? But because of the Families podcast, Trisha, I guess, felt a need to start their own podcast as well called Enemies, and they basically had this low production, low quality conversation on a couch with a camera and called it a podcast. The Enemies podcast did not last a long time, and Trisha quickly realized what that 5% was actually getting her. But then all of a sudden Trisha decided to go on a podcast tour when she was no longer a part of Frenemies. And the first one was on Tana's podcast called Cancelled, where they just kind of talk shit about Frenemies, they talk shit about other things, they talk shit about each other. So Trisha went on Tana's podcast, and then More importantly, Trisha decided to go on the Mom's Basement podcast, which is hosted by Daniel Keem. Daniel Keem, also known as Keemstar, is a long-standing content creator here on YouTube. I believe he was also a Twitch streamer, and he's best known for his Drama Alert series where he gives updates on YouTube drama and happenings. He's also known for being quite a misogynistic douchebag online, and he has a long-standing online beef with Ethan after Daniel went on Ethan's podcast some time ago, and after they seemed to have hit it off and Daniel felt like he and Ethan were like friends almost. It turns out Ethan really didn't like Keem and was talking shit about him, and Daniel felt very butthurt by this. Since then, Daniel has made it his personal life mission to harass Ethan at any chance he could. Daniel at one point instructed his fan base to tweet at Ethan, "Death to all Jews," and at another point he had his fan base tweet pictures of horses to Hila, insinuating that Hila looks like a horse. Daniel Keem is just the worst. He's the worst. He's the worst. The worst. He's just terrible. And Trisha decided to go on his podcast. One could probably see a problem with that. Trisha decided to go on this Mom's Basement podcast with Daniel and Richard, despite the fact that Ethan has expressed that Daniel and him are mortal enemies. Trisha claims that they went on the podcast strictly to express free ideas, to challenge Daniel on a lot of the misogynistic and hurtful things he said about Ethan and other people. And although Trisha has been critical of Keemstar, literally the week before they went on the podcast, they made a whole Enemies episode saying that Keem is gross and disgusting for dating a 20-year-old girl and that he's this awful person. Literally a week later, Trisha goes on the podcast saying that she's willing to listen to him and his side of the story and all this bullshit. When this happened, when Trisha went on the Mom's Basement podcast, it was also the same week that the H3H3 channel got banned from posting because they made a mean joke about Daniel. Daniel posted a video to Twitter saying that they had tweeted at Susan, who is the CEO of YouTube, saying that Ethan had violated community guidelines and he needs to be made an example of and all this stuff. He also admitted to regularly emailing YouTube about Ethan, saying that he is always violating community guidelines and that he gets away with everything, even though he no. But Keemstar admits to being a snitch to H3H3. H3H3 isn't allowed to post for a week, and that is when Trisha goes on the Mom's Basement podcast. And on this podcast, despite Trisha's claims of wanting to go on there to challenge Keem and to do all this super righteous and amazing things, what in reality happens is they have a 30-minute conversation where they literally only talk shit about Ethan the entire time. The entire 30 minutes, which, by the way, they cut the episode short because their producer has to leave, but in reality, they just didn't want to deal with Trisha for longer than they had to. So after about 30 minutes of them talking crap about Ethan, Keem kicks Trisha out of the studio and then has Gabby Hanna come in after and record an episode. This obviously made Ethan livid. He wasn't allowed to respond via YouTube, but when Daniel tweeted out a picture of Trisha being on the podcast, Ethan retweeted it saying, I'm not gonna lie, no funny business, this really does hurt my feelings. And Trisha responded with a barrage of TikTok saying that Ethan's this and Ethan's that, and that she's fully justified for going on the podcast, and that this and that, blah, blah, blah. Just a whole bunch of fucking noise pollution. It was so annoying watching that. After Ethan's forced break, he comes back with an H3 podcast, basically reacting to what Keem and Trisha had talked about on Mom's Basement, and said that this was the ultimate betrayal. He will never forgive Trisha. He knows that Trisha knows how much this hurts him. And not only did Keem talk to Gabby immediately after Trisha had left their podcast, apparently right when the Frenemies podcast ended, Gabby reached out to Ethan and said, "Hey, have me on the episode." And although Ethan admitted that this would be very interesting and generate a lot of money and views, he decided no because he knew his friendship with Trisha was more important than that. Now, did Trisha show that same respect back to Ethan? No, she did not. Ethan also talks about how ridiculous Keemstar is and all the cringy, crazy things that he does in order to stay relevant on a dying platform like his. Ethan also points out how they just clearly used Trisha to get at Ethan because, again, the episode was only 30 goddamn minutes and they immediately kicked Trisha out. And Ethan says that Trisha was so happy to be used by Keem and that there's no loyalty between them anymore. He's deeply hurt by this. It was a shitty, classless move from Trisha. That was. I don't care what freedom of speech bullshit she tries to push. I don't care what kind of whole social justice nonsense she wants to throw at it. There is no reason, and there is never a reason for anyone to go on Keemstar's podcast. So not only was Ethan getting at Trisha for the whole Keemstar situation, Donna, Ethan's mom, started commenting on it, saying that she was so excited to go to her wedding, and calling her a little weasel. Now this prompted Trisha to post a series of tweets and I believe a series of TikToks calling Donna a toxic, horrible person, saying that what she, Donna, texted to Moses is the worst thing in the world and she'll never speak it. She, as in Trisha, or they, I should say. Sorry, there's just so much going on here. Trisha says that they would never wish that on anyone and that Donna is a sick, disgusting human being for ever saying anything about her and Moses, and the things that she put into the universe are unforgivable. And Donna's like, okay. And this whole mysterious text from Donna to Moses becomes a new topic of conversation, and it gets to the point where Ethan and Donna have to address it on the 9th episode of Families. On the 9th episode, they talk about the whole situation with Trisha, where the family kind of is at and how they feel about her. And they also reveal what this whole horrible text that Trisha had freaked out about was actually about. And I'm going to read it verbatim. This is what Donna texted Moses when the whole frenemies bullshit was in high swing and a lot of things were happening between Trisha and Ethan and everyone else. Moses: if your sister has a miscarriage because of this stress, I will hold you and Trisha responsible. Stop this nonsense enough. Now this was quite a text, Donna. Quite a text. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say it's an unreasonable thing to say because Donna is 100% right. At this point, Hila had just announced her pregnancy. She is in that crucial first 3 months of pregnancy where the fetus is a little bit more delicate and needs a little bit more care and consideration for it to grow healthy and happily. And with all the stress happening because of Trisha and Ethan, one could definitely assume and think that this might affect Hila in some way. And of course, because Hila had went through such a journey and such a struggle to get pregnant, everyone was a little bit on edge as to whether or not the stress was going to be the thing that tips everything over the edge. And Donna, being a mom, being a grandmother, reached out to Moses and said, hey, you know that this is bad. Please stop it. And this was just something that everyone was thinking and no one said. And of course, Trisha had an extreme reaction to it because there's this underlying sensitivity Trisha has about pregnancy and Hila that I'm sure has some kind of negative effect on Trisha's ability to navigate this kind of subject matter. And she has extreme reactions to it, and instead of just taking it as, hey, stop causing so much trouble for everyone, it's stressing everybody out, she reads it as an omen that Donna is putting on Trisha and that if it happens, it's Trisha's fault. After that episode, Trisha said some more really distasteful things about Donna and insinuated that they were going to expose all the dark secrets that Ethan and his family were hiding, and Ethan, as a response to everything that happened between Donna, everything that happened with Trisha, decided to dissolve the Frenemies podcast and end the series at 10 episodes. Since this whole mess, Trisha has deleted most of the YouTube videos regarding this drama. I'm not sure if they deleted the TikTok videos. There were a lot of them, but they did delete the YouTube videos regarding all of this drama. And H3 has not really done their best in regards to staying away from it. They still say little things here and there about Trisha, and recently played a deleted clip in which Zach, one of the H3H3 crew, calls Trisha a bitch mid-conversation, not to her face, but when they're reacting to a video of her. But still, it's like, why would you post that? You know it's gonna stir the pot. You know it's offensive. That's why you cut it out to begin with. Why show it now? They all, for the most part, have kind of stayed in their corner, and H3H3 actually took another break voluntarily this time due to mental health, and it turns out that Hila is experiencing a little bit of difficulty during this pregnancy regarding the baby's development in the kidney area. So I just want to quickly say, Hila, if you're watching, you're definitely not, but I wish you a very happy and healthy pregnancy. I hope all is going well for you. You are a true queen, and we love you more than Ethan. Ethan has completely foregoed the Frenemies and Families set and concept and instead opted for a new show with Hassan Piker titled Leftovers, where they're going to talk more about politics rather than like internet drama. Now, there is a bunch of stuff that has come up about Moses as well, which I'm not going to talk about because it seems like it's adding a lot of tension between the family, and it's really stuff that should just be handled behind the scenes between all of them, and I just want to stay out of it and not perpetuate anything that doesn't need to be perpetuated. But that is it. That is the entire Families, Frenemies, Trisha, Ethan drama timeline summarized as best as I humanly could do. I want you all to know that this video took a long time to produce, not only because it was a lot of content to go through. I mean, damn near 39 times at least an hour each episode of Frenemies, plus the Families, plus the H3 podcast. It was just so much to comb through, and it was basically like 6 months worth of drama condensed into this video. I'm sure I've left out a couple of things here and there that are worth noting, so if you want to enunciate it or emphasize it in the comments below, I highly encourage you do. Let's keep the conversation going and let's dissect more aspects of this that we can learn from. My final note and my final thing I want to say about Ethan and Trisha is that I do genuinely think that they are friends. I don't think that this whole situation is going to keep them from, shut up, I'm busy. I don't think this whole instance and situation is going to stop them from eventually reconciling and becoming friends again. They obviously are going to see each other because Moses and Trisha are still getting married and live together. So it's only a matter of time before they resolve these issues or at least become civil with each other. And I genuinely hope that Trisha is able to develop and maintain a career that isn't based off of outlandish behavior and extreme reactions to things. And I hope that Ethan is able to start communicating more effectively, and I wish him best of luck on the new Leftovers podcast with Hassan Piker. I'm sure that's going to do really well. And at the end of the day, both of these people are still making millions of dollars, so nothing really matters. They both made a lot of money from this situation. This was probably a very profitable season for both of them because everyone was tuning into everything every 5 seconds. Every drama channel had a segment about Trisha and Ethan because so much was happening. This is where Frenemies stands. I appreciate you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe and comment something below. I will link everything that I used on my face today, including my socials down below, along with any helpful resources I think are relevant. I hope to see you in my next video. I will be back on a regular schedule. I needed to take a break because life was just getting to be too much, and this video was so much research. It just took a little longer than expected. I appreciate your patience, and if you're ever looking for updates, be sure to check my community tab. With that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!